This is Ed Stewart. Ed is the curator at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. He knows a thing or two about real spaceships. But what does he know about the fictional variety and how they measure up to the real thing? This is Curator VX.
Gary, tell me a little bit about going to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama, and the Vomit Comet at the Johnson Space Center.
There are two separate things. The space camp is in Huntsville, and the barf ship is in Houston.
As part of the lead up to their roles in filming, they came and did a program of space camp activities here at camp. Outside of that, I don't know much more, but they were definitely here. And they definitely have their space camp wings. I think what makes it an important film in general is that it was the first film made about the space program that was focused around an accident. That's what makes it important kind of culturally, right? Is you had this more true representation of something that wasn't just a let's talk about the heroes in the situation. It was let's talk about the heroes in this situation and let's see the adversity that they have to overcome. And also, it's not just the astronauts themselves. You get to know more about the flight controllers. You start seeing bigger picture how all of this technology comes together. And this is where I think it starts making a difference for the people that are in the community that love the space program and that love the history of it. You don't often see the engineers. You don't often see the flight controllers, and you're seeing that. So you get a much broader picture of not only what it takes to put an astronaut in space, but how you can solve the problems and all of the different parts and pieces that go together to accomplish a mission. In watching the film, of course, the suits are a huge part of any of the Apollo missions, and they're very iconic. I would say they're represented really well in the film. The biggest, I guess, inaccuracy, if there was anything that I would say there's, I'm not sure they would have let him keep chewing the gum for that long. I think they would have made him spit his gum out long before he was actually in his suit. But I won't swear to that. Who knows? Things were a little different back then. If there was one thing that I would say that didn't look 100% right, once they've suited up and they've connected their portable air packs and everything, the suits don't seem as rigid as they should be, right? There's a little bit of a pressure differential between inside the suit and outside the suit, but the suits did seem a little saggier or a little quote unquote softer than they should have been at that point. Otherwise, I mean, they're great replications in terms of a costume for representing a historical object.
We have liftoff.
To this day, I'm amazed at how well the effects work for the Saturn V holds up. There's nothing super glaring on how we see the Saturn V represented, whether it's the launch sequence, whether it's the staging, how it looks on the pad, etc. It does have just the tiniest little bit of uncanny valley with it in some shots, but it's clear to me that they studied the real launch footage as much as possible to recreate the camera angles and everything for their launch. So I would say it's one of the best representations of the Saturn V ever put on screen. If there was one thing that I thought was out of sequence, if I remember right, the launch abort system doesn't come off at the right time in the launch sequence in the film, but that's such a minor detail for what overall is not quite a documentary, but pretty close in terms of conveying the events of what happened.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
There's an interesting thing that you can do now that you couldn't easily do in 1995. All of the mission transcripts are now available online. They're publicly available from NASA. So you could go through line by line if you really wanted to kind of suss out what was actually happening and how closely they got the dialogue and everything. And I've never done that. And I'm not compelled to do it because ultimately what I think is no matter how accurate the dialogue might be or the exact sequence of events might or might not be, that scene conveys, I think, the intensity of what was happening and there's nothing about it that says to me you're giving them the wrong impression about what happened. I love the shot where they're kind of following the issue, the problem that's about to happen up into the service module, and you see like the tops of the oxygen tanks, then you hear all this noise and ripping and tearing. That's conveyed really well in the interior shots too, where you see like, you hear the sounds that are happening and you hear everything that's going on, you see everything shuddering and moving around. I'm sure some people out there are going, well, you're in space, how can you hear the explosion, or how can you hear all of these things? Because they're inside the ship. The spacecraft is vibrating and ripping and tearing and everything, and that's transmitted through the air inside the craft to the astronauts on the inside. I like the way that they show the LEM and the command module kind of being pushed around and everything, because that's accurate. Whether or not it would have been as dramatic as what you see on the screen is a different story. The cockpit alarms that are going off, the little red lights that are flashing, I think some of those sometimes confuse a lot of people because it's an oxygen tank that blew out. A lot of people don't realize that the command module received all of its electrical power from these things called fuel cells. The Apollo fuel cells take oxygen and hydrogen, combine it together, and it produces water, but in that process it also produces electricity. So when you see the undervolt, the must be undervolt warning, what that's telling them is that the fuel cell that's attached to the oxygen supply isn't getting what it needs to be able to produce the amount of electricity that's supposed to be producing.
We never lost an American in space. We're sure as not going to lose one on my watch. Failure is not an option.
I wonder if he realized when he said that how iconic of a phrase that was going to become. Like it has well made its way outside of, the space program. I think lots of people use the expression, they know it's an idiom, and they have no idea where it comes from. Or is it one of those things that he said and it didn't register? But that scene is spot on to what we were just talking about in terms of the ships are nothing without electricity. And so they're talking about how can we reduce down the amount of consumption so that we can work within what the fuel cells can produce and not, completely destroy the batteries, not let the astronauts freeze to death, let them to be able to do the maneuvering that they need to do. There's a magic of teamwork there. There's a magic of the right leader at the right time. And there's a magic of the expertise and knowledge of the technology that they're working with, and knowing that if they can make it to this number, this 12 amps, right, then we know that we can fire the engines, we can get them to turn the ship around so that the heat shield's facing the right way. We just have to figure out how to get from point A to point B. We don't know how to do it yet, but we know that that's the road that we need to travel down. And they are being instructed to keep all possibilities open. Talk to the designers, talk to the assemblers, talk to the manufacturers, go down whatever rabbit hole you need to go down to find me one more half of an amp that I can save so that we can make this happen.
4.
Oh, let's just go.
2, 1, ignition!
My favorite thing about the scenes filmed in the command module and the lunar module is that a lot of them were shot on a KC-135 doing parabolic microgravity flights. There's the scene where, and I don't remember which astronaut / actor it was, gets sick, and that was a genuine reaction because they were not reacting well to the parabolic arc flights. The fact that they were able to accomplish that, really not using wire work and stuff, they were actually able to build these sets and put them on planes, is fantastic. But what I would say is they learned a lesson from NASA, because NASA was doing KC-135 training flights for their missions, and they would build simulated spacecraft inside KC-135s. For instance, in the Gemini program, there were ingress-egress trainers and there were rendezvous and docking trainers that they would have built to scale inside the fuselage of the KC-135 so they could practice maneuvers, which I'm sure was a huge challenge for them trying to film, because you only get that very limited window of time where you can shoot a scene in true microgravity. The actors have to remember their lines, they have to not hit their heads. So I'm sure it was a huge production challenge, but it was fantastic to be able to do it, because there's no better way to get microgravity on film, in my opinion, than to do it that way. Because when you're doing wire work, you may be flying around and acting like you're weightless and everything, but your suit that you're wearing, the clothing that you're wearing, your hair, those things cannot ignore the effects of gravity on them. And so there's these little tiny cues that you can pick up on that show that that it's either wire work or that it's being, computer generated or in some other way a special effect. Now, the way the ships were represented, their models that they used for the exterior shots were really good. It's hard to find fault really with much about them. And the interiors, it's pretty clear that they spent a lot of time studying the interiors of the spacecraft. A lot of times when you have somebody that's working and specializing in building a spacecraft as a prop or as a set for the movies, they're also people that are really enthusiastic about the space program. So they love delving into those details, and you kind of see that care in the replication of the cockpits and the control panels and everything in the two spacecraft. Simulation is a huge part of spaceflight. It's been a huge part of spaceflight since the very beginning. One of the best things that you can do for an astronaut is to put them in a functioning simulator, because it gives them familiarity with their environment. It gives them a level of understanding and comfort, knowing that this is the procedure that I need to follow. This is how the switch feels when it's working right. And, this is the reaction that the spacecraft is supposed to give me when I do it. What they were doing here with that scene is great, because Sinise's, character, Mattingly, the astronaut, knew the interior of the cockpit because he was backup, or he was prime crew, but he was familiar with the vehicles and he was familiar with the routines of the mission because he had already done so much training. So putting him in the simulator and helping the technicians and the engineers troubleshoot that, I think was an extremely valuable tool that allowed them to work faster than they might have otherwise. Is it possible that they could have accomplished the same outcome with a different astronaut that was training for a different mission? I think so, because, Apollo 14's crew, a lot of what they would have had to have done would have been very similar up to that point, right? It might be a different trajectory, but your procedures are going to be very similar. But I think what they had with Mattingly available to them was the ability to have someone that was already familiar with the flight plan, know where their milestones were supposed to be, in exactly the same places, instead of in something close to it that the crew for Apollo 14 would have had to have done. Little side note, the simulator they used for that is actually now on display over in the Davidson Center for Space Exploration. So if you're here and you liked Apollo 13, the film, make sure you stop by and see that. It wasn't in the movie, it was in the real one.
Those CO2 levels are going to be getting toxic.
Well, I suggest you gentlemen invent a way to put a square peg in a round hole.
If your CO2 builds up past a certain level, your body will absorb that before it will absorb the O2. So you have to keep the CO2 levels low. The challenge that they were facing is that they were running out of usable lithium hydroxide cartridges in the lunar module, and they wanted to transfer the ones over from the command module because at this point they were living in the LEM, but the LEO canisters from the command module are square, they're almost cubes. Basically what they did on the ground was they took a LEM style canister and they took a command module style canister, and then they took all of the stuff that they knew the astronauts had in the capsule and said, this is what you have to make the square peg connect to the round hole. They pulled it off. They used plastic bags, they used duct tape, they used the hoses from their spacesuits. I mean, it's nothing short of genius in order to figure out how to make this happen, because there's no running to Lowe's to go pick up a gasket, right? This definitely is one of those things that you had to solve that problem where it would have been a true disaster instead of going on to become what is known as the successful failure. Right? All of these individual things that have presented themselves over the course of the mission that they were able to overcome, they were able to find solutions to, and able to communicate those to the crew in a way that the crew could execute them in a quick and efficient way and see themselves out the other end of it. It really had an impact on the way people think about how dangerous spaceflight is. So I think it had a big cultural impact in the US, around the world, and within the sort of operating culture of NASA at the time. A little disappointing about that is that you had Apollo 11, landed on the moon, huge viewership, and people were really engaged with it. Then that kind of dropped for Apollo 12. And then, unfortunately, the only reason Apollo 13 ended up getting the attention that it did was because it was a near disaster. And then after that, you see the public's interest kind of start to wane because, oh, well, we did it. We accomplished the goal. We met Kennedy's mandate. You know, anything that happens after that is gravy. I think that there's some lessons to be learned there in terms of how to communicate what the program is doing. And NASA's worked really hard over time to talk about all the science that they've learned and all the things that are accomplished on each mission. But unfortunately, I think some of it still gets lost in the background of whatever else is happening in the world at the time. So that was Curator Reacts to Apollo 13, the film from 1995. If you liked this episode, give us a thumbs up down below and make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you can see more of this curator reacting to whatever film's next.